A visionary, a remarkable marketer, an aggressive businessman, a passionate innovator, Steve Jobs embodied all this and more. The world woke up shocked and saddened by the death of a man who single-handedly made Apple one of the most iconic brands in this lifetime and went on to make the company the most valued in the world. But with the demise of this iconic leader and this tech maverick, Apple finds itself at crossroads. Thus, the demise of Steve Jobs marked the end of the Apple era. Khushbu Patodia and Saki Deshpande attempt to answer this one.
3 apples changed the course of the world. Adam and Eve's forbidden apple, Newton's apple, and finally Steve Jobs' apple. That was a popular tweet doing the rounds amongst the Twitterati on October 5th last week, the day the world lost a visionary like no other.
Death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you.
One who had many names, the Michelangelo of digital age, the Edison of our times, or simply the current generation's Isaac Newton. That was Steve Jobs. In his own words, Steve said, "I believe Apple's brightest and most innovative days are ahead of it, and I look forward to watching and contributing to its success in a new role." This was a statement that came by when he resigned from his Apple CEO position. But little did one know that Steve had probably foreseen his life coming to an end soon. Now without Steve, the big question is, does this mean the end of the Apple era?
But I am concerned about long-term their innovation waning.
If you combine the entrepreneurship of Thomas Watson with the talent of Michael Jackson and the avant-garde spirit of Picasso, then you get a Steve Jobs.
The strongest feeling would be to make him proud and work the hardest that they can to continue to prove that Apple is still Apple.
I don't see them losing fizz or momentum, at least in the near term for the next 18 months.
I think near term, no issue. Product roadmaps would be in place. What products probably Steve even had in mind would already have been discussed. These things are normally done 18 months, 3 years in advance. But the reality is technology changes very fast. So that visionary brain to capture that trend and to at the right time bring out the right product is very hard to replicate.
Experts feel the near future of Apple Inc. is secure. Though for the long term, the company will have to take some major steps to be able to sustain and of course multiply its $350 billion worth of assets. And these include taking a cue from companies that have fast learned the Apple way and may emerge as tough competition for Apple going forward. Simply put, who gains from Apple's loss?
And I do think that they're coming under increasing attack by companies, especially Samsung, especially at the low end as well as the high end. And I think that without Steve Jobs, this is actually going to become significantly worse for them to fend off. So I think Samsung is much closer to Apple in market share for smartphones, but HTC would be the next one. I think it will take a while, though, for Apple to fall behind HTC if they ever do, because I think Apple's lead is still quite considerable over HTC.
The brand that is probably most to gain from this, because it has learned the lessons really. When it's a brand, it's a company that internally says, look, I'm the Apple for the rest of the world, is Samsung. Samsung has understood the power of design. It has understood the power of technology. It has understood that it's not just building great technology, but it has to look beautiful. What they're unable to do, however, is to get the yield and get the profit that an Apple is able to get out, simply because Apple was able to charge extraordinary premium prices while keeping its costs very low and locking out the competition from using the same machining and component technology.
So from a competitor perspective, my advice would be, do not think that you can take advantage of this and continue to work and innovate, because Apple does remain the benchmark for what not just the phone, the PC, but now the tablet business really is.
According to Nielsen data, in August 2011, Samsung held a 16.2% market share, giving neck-to-neck competition to Apple that held 19.25% of the market. But early signs of threat came in with the recent iPhone 4S launch, which of course received a cold consumer response.
I have one and I love the phone, so I don't know how much better it can be.
Looking forward to the announcement of the iPhone 5.
Was it great expectations, poor delivery? Was it the absence of Jobs in his typical black turtleneck and blue denims delivering the keynote?
We sold our 4 billionth song. Isn't that great?
Or was it simply the fact that Jobs' successor, Tim Cook, had big shoes to fill? But the big question is, can Cook pull it off?
Let's be very frank about it. Tim Cook is not Steve Jobs and Steve Jobs was not Tim Cook. Tim Cook comes from an operational side and he's done an outstanding job of supporting Apple in terms of where Apple is today as world's largest company, which is really a remarkable accomplishment from where it came back in the 80s, where it almost was disappearing. And Tim Cook very much played a very critical role in that accomplishment. But Tim is not Steve.
What I'm yet to see, though, is that he has the soul of Apple. Jobs is the soul of Apple, and Apple, if anything, was a company with an enormous soul. I think in some ways Jonathan Ive, the designer who's been designing a lot of the products, has brought Steve Jobs' soul, and thinking into the limelight, or that his, extreme focus on simplicity, even down to cussedness. I will only have one button on the phone. I will not have a right click on the mouse, and so on and so forth. It remains to be seen whether, Cook works well with Ive and others to be able to combine operational efficiency with somebody else's soul. Because he certainly, by himself, I don't think he's a particularly inspiring man.
I would say the biggest strength of Tim Cook is that he knows that his strengths are different from Steve Jobs'. And he has no desire to try to pretend any otherwise. I think that's his biggest strength. But as a company, should Apple always be a showman-driven company? Should Apple always be a super artist-driven company? It's just not realistic.
There's reason to believe that it won't be easy for Tim Cook, or anybody for that matter, to replace Steve in the near future.
This is my first product launch since being named CEO. I'm sure you didn't know that.
Jobs' death had an immediate ripple effect on Apple's shares that saw a 1.5% decline the same day. In the immediate aftermath of Jobs' resignation this August, Apple's share price tumbled 5%. Quick flashback to 1985 when Jobs was sacked from the company. Apple began foundering, and it was Microsoft and Intel chips that became market movers. Until 1997, when Jobs returned, Apple had accumulated nearly $2 billion of loss in 2 years, with shares at a record low, and was at its third CEO in 4 years. To ensure history doesn't repeat itself, the belief is that Apple needs to reduce its product pricing and emerge as a consumer product and not elitist as it stands today. Not just that, Apple will also need to get over its US obsession and make an earnest attempt to enter other markets, particularly Asia, something their arch-rival Samsung realized very early.
Someone also said, "Farewell, Steve. We hardly knew you, and there isn't anyone who knew us better." From the iconic unveiling of the Apple Macintosh in 1984 to the iPhone 4S, the latest innovation from the company, Apple has crossed many a milestone with its own share of ups and downs. The bottom line being, make technology simple and get people closer, just like this.
Absolutely, Khushbu. What was also remarkable was Apple's knack of being talked about with minimum publicity. Steve's keynotes, also famously known as Steve Notes, could easily be one of Apple's strongest advertising strategies. It never failed to grab attention.
Bang on, Saki, but with Apple's biggest brand ambassador gone, the future of Apple is a mixed bag of promises with a considerable amount of skepticism.
He told us to stay hungry and stay foolish. The brain behind all of Apple's insane innovations was an inspiration for many across the world and within Apple too. Steve's persona had an impact on all his employees, and when we caught up with some of them who had the privilege of interacting with him, what we got was a more deeper, more poignant insight into the genius that Steve Jobs was.
I was at Apple Computer for about 4 years in probably the most tumultuous time in Apple's history. And I had the privilege of being asked to present a project, more a summary report to him in the Apple boardroom. We went there. Steve came in his shorts, sneakers, no socks, put his feet up on the table and said, "Shoot, you guys have 10 minutes." For somebody who had spent probably the previous month preparing that presentation, that was a very intimidating moment. At the same time, curiously charismatic moment. I felt I had 10 minutes of a person's time that could potentially, if utilized well, make a big difference, both to my career as well as to the company. Fortunately for us, the meeting ended up lasting 2.5 hours, and that was his way. He was not normal. He was not normal in a very, very positive way. Steve used to always scoff almost at focus groups. He used to say, the consumers don't know what they want until you show it to them. I think that was the genius of the man.
Till 93, 94, I was with Ogilvy in Hong Kong, and I was hired out of there by a Silicon Valley agency called CKS Partner. I was the creative director in charge of retail anyway, all of the B2C clients, and eventually over time came the chance to handle a bit of the Apple account. Now the interesting thing out here was there was an enormous amount of fear as well as respect among my own founders who all used to work with Steve Jobs. And I was I was coached really tightly on what to say, what not to say, how to say yes to no matter everything Steve says, and I found it a little difficult to do. I remember going to him with the media plan in maybe 95, 96, which involved a buy on Yahoo. This was 15, 16 years ago. And presenting creative, and Steve brought up this entire thing where he was pretty, hardcore about who the hell watches these and who the hell sees these ads. I don't believe in this. I just want to build a website. And it took a lot of convincing in numbers to tell him that the amount of traffic that Yahoo got was far greater than the amount of traffic that Apple.com was getting. And while it was important to build Apple.com, it was not a broad portal, and he hence needed to get traffic. And I think it was really important that you stood your ground. He was just the kind of a guy that, he shouted at something and you had to just stand back and state your facts. And once he got the facts, he said, okay, fine, done. He was just waiting to see if you had confidence in yourself. He was really one of those leaders.
Well, I met Steve when I was in charge of the Pentium project. Andy Grove introduced me to him during one of Steve's visit to Intel. And there's an interesting story behind that visit. As you may recall, back in the 90s, Apple computers were using for their brain a microprocessor from Motorola. And Motorola was Intel's competitor. So in some ways, indirectly, Apple was also an Intel's competitor. Now, what Intel and we all realized after a while was that actually the only innovator in the PC industry happened to be Apple. And in that context, we reached out to Apple and Steve Jobs and started a friendly relationship. My takeaway from Steve is it's not just about technology, but how do you take technology and make it very useful and user-friendly for the customers who use it.